It's a fancy venue here. I was going to change my talk just to be an interpretive dance. So as Talesh said, I'm Martin Pachol. I'm the CTO, co-founder of Magento. I'm going to be speaking on things that we can do to secure sites just beyond what PCI DSS requires. From particular an owner's perspective of a website, they get a pass on PCI, and they think that's all they need to do, especially when you're dealing with the smaller merchants, medium-sized stores, things along those lines. They get that pass on DSS, and they think they're good for another 3 months. And what we really need to do from the technical side is tell them that that's really not where security ends. It's where it's beginning. And to really make that argument to a store owner, you really need to just bring up these guys. Equifax, you've probably heard this story. You've probably been screwed by them. But it bears repeating because it would be funny if it wasn't so horrible. If you're not from the US, Equifax is one of the 3 credit monitoring agencies for the country. They're contracted by the government to do this. So you could have not done any business with them directly. You could have never given them, never wanted them to have your personal information. They probably lost your personal information. They lost 145 million records, which is over half the US population. And that's going to include not only all the information that someone would potentially need to get a credit card in your name, but they could probably get a mortgage in your name as well. And they passed their PCI audit. And not only did they do that, but they're also on the PCI Standard Security Council. And they failed to find a remote executional vulnerability in Apache struts. This vulnerability was released in March. They got hacked in May. They didn't realize until July, and they didn't tell anybody about it until September. So suffice to say, they could have done better on a lot of fronts. Really kind of made it look like they looked at Yahoo's 2013 breach and said, "Hold my beer." Now, before I get some of the downfalls of PCI DSS and the tools we can use to better secure our sites, here's a general question. Who is really responsible for security? If, as a store owner, you don't have somebody in particular that comes to mind, you could have a problem. And if you said everybody, that really ultimately means nobody. Somebody really needs to take the lead on security, because ultimately it is their store, and having that one person in charge can assure that they can find the right resources to do what they need to do to not only enforce standards that are mandated by PCI, but also cover things that are not. So where do we start here? First, we're going to assume that you've already passed your PCI DSS audit. So you have an establishment of best practices. You've got their security scan that's mandated every 90 days, and it's going to provide you with some legal protection. Sorry, I got lost in my notes. And so, why isn't that PCI scanning enough? The standards around those are very broad. They were really made by large companies that can be more concerned about even internal threats as external. These are largely going to focus on procedural, physical, server-level kind of vulnerabilities. And when it comes to the application, though, they're not really able to evolve at the speed of technology. Every application is going to be custom. There's a variety of platforms. There's a variety of languages. The scanners that they're using are trying to scan for everything. And a PCI scanner really only knows about the exploits it knows about. So what's the scanner really going to be missing here? You could be missing existing malware that's on the site, missing patches even, known Magento exploits. So first, where we can start working, that's kind of not really mandated in PCI, but PCI touches on, is server level security. It's largely not something that, as a store owner, you're going to have to worry a lot about unless you're hosting your own site in grandma's basement someplace. It's going to be largely the part of your hosting company. And these are places where PCI can cover a lot. It's going to have general best practices for the industry, but there are still some common things that can come up on audits. Typically, they're going to be very minor things that the host can easily take care of. They're going to be stuff that basically the host has to have open to make everybody happy, but they always know how to fix them. So the first place that we can have areas to play that PCI still touches on, but are not necessarily mandated, is the web application firewall level. This is the gatekeeper for your application. And it's going to provide a lot of sub-services along with that, DDoS protection, content request filtering, the general firewall, things along those lines. There are hardware solutions out there that do this. Financially, they're going to be out of reach for pretty much all store owners. We're talking about hundreds of $1,000s just for one box that has no redundancy. Luckily, though, there are third-party solutions through proxies. These include things like Cloudflare. Security has their own version of that as well. These are going to be able to filter out probably 99% of the automated attacks that you're going to see. It does a very good job at that. If you're being specifically targeted by a hacker, though, it is possible to bypass these. They could go after the hosted site itself, trying to go after the web server, or even trying to attack the network and gain infiltration through that. Lastly, in this class, we kind of have mod security. There's Nginx WAF. These aren't going to have nearly the robust nature of those external proxies are, but they're kind of better than nothing. They have base rules that will protect against some SQL injection, directory transversal, things like that. The only mod security rules I know specifically that were written for Magento are on the Mage Security Council website. If you haven't seen that, check it out. I'll be talking more about some of the tools that we have on there as well a bit later in the talk here. The next place we can go to here is server security. Another thing that PCI touches on is least privilege. And it really is kind of up to you really what least privilege is. How far does that go? And really the answer is we can block everything that they don't need access to. If it's open, we have to worry about it. Shut it down if you can. So the server is going to have, by default from a hosting company, a variety of service ports open. The control panel is going to have the place where hopefully you can manage your whitelists for all your other services. That kind of needs to be open. Barring that, VPNs are an option to be able to restrict access to. You have a central office. SSH, we can limit down just to what the developers need to access, even if they're remote. They can go in, whitelist their address, get access that way. MySQL should be even more restrictive. Really only the web server should have access to it unless you're doing some specific debugging tools, in which case add your IP address, then remove it back. If you're using FTP, just don't. It's just an ancient thing, kind of like having your presentation on paper to read off of, but it's just a bad protocol. Even if it's FTPFS, FTPS, I should say, you should really switch to SFTP. That's going to be SSH, and you want to use SSH keys as well for that second level of authentication. So what about your actual web ports, though? Those have to be open, but not entirely. This is where Geo Ip Blocking comes in. If you're not doing business in a country, why bother serving to it? We've seen cases where we've just blocked Russia and China from a site, and their whole traffic has gone down by 90%, and they did no business in those countries. Particularly those countries will have bots that are highly aggressive in their crawl rates, and just a lot of malicious attacks come from these as well. So if it is an option at your web host to block these, it's a good idea to do that. These do not really affect SEO, except in those regions which you don't care about. It also eliminates a lot of potential for DDoS attacks at your application level, which Magento is quite vulnerable to. So on to Magento-specific security. What's going to be beyond PCI here? Here, they're going to be talking about kind of a collection of tools, some specific for Magento that have been developed by the community. And these tools go beyond what PCI requires, whether it can be internal scans or for reactive reasons to find out if I have a breach, to be able to notify us sooner, or if it's proactively scanning for things that those PCI scanners might not necessarily cover. First, am I already compromised? That's a scary question to ask, but it can be the case. As a hosting company, we see customers come over to us and we run a security check on them by default as soon as they're migrated, and quite often we see these breaches occurring. And for when we are scanning for these, we are using, in particular, the Mage malware scanner that is available on the Mage Security Council. And for helping to clean things, we're using the Project Integrity Checker, which is also available there. The Mage malware scanner that is specifically designed for Magento, it is using a Yara database and has a custom-built scanner that goes through and has the signatures for known malware that we've found within Magento. These are all contributed by various members of the community, and does a pretty good job. We're catching a lot of stuff, and we're continually adding to it as attacks evolved. And the Project Integrity Checker, that is simply a tool that has checksums for all the Magento versions, and they're fully patched versions that we can compare against installations to find out if any core files have been modified. For seeing stuff like that, in particular, files like config.php that's in includes, and anything related to credit card processing. If we're seeing those files modified, that's really indicative of an attack. So if there is malware on a site, the first thing to really do is have to focus on how it happened and not who. Especially when you have a store owner that this is their first rodeo, and as far as having experience with malware, their first indication is going to be, how do I find this person that did this, and how can I beat them to death? And the chances of you finding them are pretty much near zero. And you can't go and immediately start deleting files that are potentially compromised. All those kind of files, there are evidence, and the important thing is finding the vector of the attack. So once you are able to establish that you are compromised somehow, finding that timeline is incredibly important to finding the vector. If you're not able to narrow that down, you're going to be searching through logs together. Even if you have a window of 72 hours, at that point it's going to be very difficult to find out exactly what happened, how you're compromised. When looking at files, you also can't really trust the file date. Hackers in the last couple of years have gotten really good about preserving those file dates or modifying them so you don't know exactly when files have changed. So in those kind of cases, it's important to know if a file was injected, a new file in the system, refer back to the logs and see where is that file first trying to be called in the logs. So they injected that file, where is it now being called? Once you can establish that, then you can work backwards, try and find that attack vector. When you do get to the point where you're starting to clean, refer back to a clean installation, get that base copy of Magento fully patched, make sure that you're not missing any infections. Look for files in the file system that don't belong. It helps to know the Magento file system in these cases. You want to be able to look for PHP files where they might not necessarily exist, like the skin, var folder. Those are kind of indicative attack, or files that don't meet naming conventions, things along those lines. The other thing that we've seen really in the last years is reinfection scripts. These are scripts that have been injected and reinfect other files within the system. One of the recent cases we saw that was code injected into index.php, which then infected config, includes config.php, and then from there it would infect files in the credit card processing layer to put in a credit card skimmer. So once we've gotten a clean bill of health, these same tools can be used then for continuous scanning. In particular, the malware scanner, we run that every day across all of our sites. So we can, if there is an infection again, we can get that timeline more reliably. Certainly that project integrity checker, you can run that. That's a very simple tool as well. The other thing you can use is your source control. If you have files that are modified outside of source control on your production environment, either someone has injected files or some developer is changing files in production, which either way is an issue. So something like that can be run very often, even every 5 minutes, just to get status and tell me if I have any changed files on that system. PCI, DSS standards, they want you to have antivirus installed, but don't rely on this to catch anything. We have Claim AV running on every server, and it's never found anything for us. So as far as that being protection from malware, those application-based level attacks, the code is usually quite custom, and they just don't have the signatures for that. So now that we've covered some of the reactive methods to find out if we've been compromised, we really want to look at how can we prevent it from ever happening. For these, magereport.com, you've probably seen this, been familiar with it. It is basically tells you if you're missing any patches that are known out there. And as far as first glances for a website, it's a great tool for that, if it's something new you're taking on. And then there's also the Magento security scanner, which they announced that at Imagine this last year. It was just publicly released last week. It does a lot of stuff Magento does, and seems to go beyond that. It seems to have some of the OWASP standards, that's Open Web Application Security Project standards, that PCI scanners kind of use. So they're looking for that as well. They also have a place where you can enter SSH credentials, which says coming soon. So we'll have to watch and see what that ultimately does, but that's going to be something they'll actually go in and do some internal scanning as well. Then the last one on here, OpenVAS, that is basically another OWASP scanner. It is based on the Nessus scanner, which if you're familiar with that, it was kind of one of the first scanners of that type, and it became closed source at one point. OpenVAS is the open source version for that. So that is another OWASP scanner, similar to PCI, works very well, but it's free. So you can go on, you can scan whatever environments you want without having to have those as part of some other agency doing the scanning. You can scan it yourself, dev environments, any internal environments, anything like that. Great to run before you're doing an deployment as well. So the next one is the scanning for the unknown. This one, I only have really one piece of software to mention. That's Kali, which is a open source Linux distribution that just has a ton of tools built in it all around security. It does everything from network to email, everything in between. And one particular thing on there that it does is it has tools for scanning code itself. So scanning the code is another great thing you can do before deployment. And it's not going to find remote execution vulnerabilities, but it will potentially find SQL injection, things along those lines. And the next thing on here, we have basically two kind of options for penetration testing, which sounds like they should be expensive, but really they can be somewhat affordable. I've seen sites, security companies have been willing to do a manual review for $500, which is pretty much in reach for anybody. The other option in there is putting up a bounty if somebody can hack a store. There are conferences that specifically relate to this, where they go on, they basically have, it's like our Magento hackathon, except they're actually trying to hackathon Magento. And they will go on and try and do that. The great thing about those is it'll go outside of things that a security scanner will just never be able to do, such as like they'll even look into potentially social engineering of employees, things like that, anything they can do to really get into your store. And finally, if there is an incident, have a plan. As I mentioned earlier, timelines are key to that. Having that timeline can be a difference between 500 logs and 500,000. You have to gauge the impact of it. Not every breach is going to be a catastrophic event. If you catch something really quick, it might be only a couple credit cards that are potentially compromised. It might have just been somebody that it automatically was able to inject a backdoor, but it hasn't been used at all. And finally, if there is a breach, be transparent about it. Credit card companies and payment gateways are really starting to crack down on fraud. If you're found to be potentially covering something up, then the impact to you could be twice as worse. It can even lead to you being basically blacklisted from service. So that's it for my talk.